There was a time in my life when I thought love meant constant reassurance. I thought love meant never being left undelivered, never being ignored, never feeling uncertain. I believed that if someone truly loved me, they would calm every fear inside me instantly. But the truth is, I was not searching for love. I was searching for emotional survival. Every delayed text felt like rejection. Every change in energy felt like abandonment. Every disagreement felt like the end of the relationship. And what hurt the most was this: I kept calling it love while slowly losing myself trying to keep it. I became addicted to closeness, addicted to validation, addicted to needing someone to constantly prove they cared. And when they pulled away, even slightly, my mind would create stories. They don't love me anymore. They're losing interest. I'm not enough. The problem was never just the relationship. The problem was the wound I carried into every relationship. Because anxious attack. Abandonment does not begin with romance. It begins with emotional instability. It begins when someone teaches you that love is inconsistent, that affection can disappear, that attention must be earned, that abandonment is always one mistake away. So you grow up becoming hyper-aware, overthinking everything, analyzing tones, watching patterns, preparing for rejection before it even happens. And eventually you become exhausted, not because you love too deeply, but because you fear losing love more than you trust receiving it. That realization changed my life, because I finally understood this. You cannot heal anxious attachment while constantly abandoning yourself. You cannot beg people to stay while neglecting your own soul. You cannot build peace while living in emotional panic every single day. Healing started the moment I stopped chasing reassurance and started rebuilding myself. And let me tell you something powerful. The hardest addiction to break is the addiction to needing someone else to make you feel worthy. That addiction will destroy your peace. It will make you tolerate disrespect. It will make you over-explain yourself, overgive, overthink, overstay. You will keep shrinking yourself just to avoid being left. But healing changes you. Healing teaches you that your value does not decrease when someone fails to recognize it. Healing teaches you that people pulling away is not always proof that you are unlovable. Sometimes it is proof that you are finally seeing clearly. I had to learn how to sit alone with my emotions without immediately running to someone for comfort. That was difficult. Because silence forces you to confront yourself. It forces you to meet the wounded version of you that still fears abandonment. And most people avoid healing because healing feels lonely before it feels peaceful. But solitude became sacred for me. I started journaling my thoughts instead of reacting emotionally. I started praying instead of panicking. I started observing my triggers instead of obeying them, and slowly I realized something incredible. My emotions were not enemies. They were messengers. They were revealing the areas inside me that still needed compassion, discipline, and healing. That changed everything. Because emotionally secure people are not people who never feel fear. They are people who no longer allow fear to control their decisions. There is power in emotional discipline, power in pausing before reacting, power in not sending the desperate paragraph, power in not chasing closure from people committed to misunderstanding you. And one of the greatest lessons I learned was this: love should not feel like constant anxiety. Real love does not keep you emotionally starving. Real love does not manipulate your nervous system. Real love does not disappear every time things become inconvenient. Healthy love brings clarity, not confusion, not emotional chaos, not endless guessing games. When someone truly values you, their consistency speaks louder than their words. And healing anxious attachment requires accepting a painful truth. Some people benefit from your insecurity. Because insecure people are easier to control, easier to manipulate, easier to keep emotionally dependent. But once you heal, once you finally know your worth, once your peace becomes more important than attention, everything changes. You stop begging. You stop forcing connections. You stop trying to convince people to love you correctly. You realize that love should be mutual, not one-sided survival. And maybe the deepest healing of all came when I stopped trying to control every outcome. Because anxious attachment is deeply connected to fear. Fear of loss, fear of rejection, fear of being alone. So you try to control everything. The conversations, the timing, the responses, the future. But control is not peace. Trust is peace. Faith is peace. Understanding that what is meant for your life will not require you to destroy yourself to keep it, that is peace. And hear me carefully. You do not heal anxious attachment by becoming cold. You heal it by becoming secure. There is a difference. Secure people still love deeply, still care deeply. still feel emotions deeply, but they no longer abandon themselves in the process. They no longer chase people who repeatedly trigger their pain. They no longer confuse inconsistency with passion. They no longer settle for emotional crumbs because they are starving for connection. Healing taught me that loneliness is temporary, but self-abandonment becomes a lifelong prison if you never confront it. So if you are on this journey right now, if you are tired of overthinking, tired of emotional exhaustion, tired of feeling like your happiness depends on someone else choosing you, listen carefully. Choose yourself first, not from ego, not from pride, but from understanding your soul deserves peace too. You deserve relationships that feel safe. You did it. Deserve communication that feels honest. You deserve love that does not constantly activate your deepest fears. And most importantly, you deserve to wake up one day no longer terrified of being left because you finally learned how to stay loyal to yourself. That is when healing truly begins. That is when peace enters your life. And that is when you finally stop searching for love to save you because you discovered the strength that was already within you all along. For a long time, I believed my worth depended on how people treated me. If they responded quickly, I felt valuable. If they became distant, I questioned myself. My confidence was tied to someone else's attention, and that is one of the most dangerous ways to live because it places your identity into the hands of people who are still trying to understand themselves. The moment they changed, my entire emotional world collapsed with them. That is what anxious attachment does. It convinces you that love must constantly be Then, in order for you to feel secure, you start searching for reassurance everywhere. You overanalyze conversations. You replay silence in your mind. You try harder, give more, and sacrifice your peace, hoping someone will finally choose you completely. But the deeper truth is this: when you do not believe you are enough on your own, no amount of external love will ever fully satisfy the emptiness within you. Healing started when I realized I had spent years begging for what I should have been building inside myself. I was asking people to provide the confidence, safety, and validation that I never learned to give myself. That realization was painful because it forced me to confront how much of my identity depended on being wanted. I had to ask myself a difficult question. Who am I when nobody is reassuring me? At first, the silence felt uncomfortable. I was so used to chasing attention that stillness felt unfamiliar. But slowly, I began rebuilding my self-worth through discipline instead of dependency. I stopped measuring my value by delayed replies or temporary emotions. I began focusing on my growth, my purpose, my habits, and my relationship with myself. I learned to speak to myself with compassion instead of criticism. And something powerful happened. The more I respected myself, the less desperate I became for validation from others. I stopped trying to force connections. I stopped shrinking myself to avoid rejection. I stopped believing that someone leaving automatically meant I was unlovable. Because confident people understand something anxious people often forget. Rejection does not define value. Someone failing to recognize your worth does not erase your worth. Not every ending is proof that you are broken. Sometimes it is proof that life is removing what no longer aligns with your growth. True healing begins when you stop chasing love from a place of fear and start living from a place of self-respect. Because when you finally know your value, you stop begging for attention and start protecting your peace. One of the biggest reasons I stayed trapped in anxious attachment was because I confused emotional intensity with love. I thought constantly thinking about someone meant they were special. I believed missing them every second was proof of deep connection. I convinced myself that the emotional highs and lows, the uncertainty, the fear, and the obsession were all part of loving deeply. But the truth is, emotional dependency can disguise itself as love so convincingly that many people never realize the difference. Dependency says, I need you to feel okay. Love says, I choose you while still being whole on my own. That difference changed my life. When you are emotionally dependent, your peace depends on another person's behavior. Their mood controls your mood. Their attention controls your confidence. If they pull away, even slightly, anxiety takes over your mind. You start panicking, overthinking, and chasing reassurance because your emotional stability is attached to their presence. That is not love. That is fear wearing the mask of love. I had to admit that many times I was not truly loving people. I was depending on them to fill the emptiness inside me. I wanted them to silence my insecurities. I wanted them to heal my loneliness. I wanted them to make me feel chosen because deep down, I did not fully choose myself. That pressure eventually destroys relationships because no human being can carry the responsibility of becoming your entire emotional foundation. Real love does not require you to lose yourself. It does not force you to constantly earn affection. It does not make you live in survival mode wondering if you are enough. Healthy love creates emotional safety, not emotional exhaustion. It allows honesty, communication, trust, and peace to exist together. One of the hardest truths I learned was that anxiety often becomes addicted to inconsistency. When someone gives attention one moment and distance the next, your nervous system becomes trapped in emotional chaos. You start craving the moments of affection even more because they temporarily relieve the fear. This cycle feels powerful, but it is not healthy. It is emotional instability creating attachment through unpredictability. Healing meant learning how to separate genuine connection from emotional addiction. I had to stop romanticizing people who constantly triggered my insecurities. I had to stop calling confusion passion. I had to stop chasing relationships that only felt exciting because they activated my fear of abandonment. And slowly, I began understanding that real love feels different. It feels calm. It feels steady. It feels safe enough for you to breathe, think clearly, and remain connected to yourself. Real love does not demand that you sacrifice your identity just to keep someone close. It allows two whole people to grow together without constantly living in fear of losing one another. For a long time, I thought, my fear of abandonment came from the relationships I experienced as an adult. I blamed heartbreak, rejection, and failed connections for the anxiety I carried. But healing forced me to look deeper. It forced me to realize that the fear did not begin when someone stopped texting back or became emotionally distant. The fear was already living inside me long before those relationships ever existed. Anxious attachment is often the voice of an unhealed inner child. It is the part of you that learned early in life that love could disappear unexpectedly. Maybe affection was inconsistent. Maybe emotional support was missing. Maybe you were only noticed when you performed well, stayed quiet, or avoided becoming a burden. Whatever the experience was, your mind adapted by becoming hyperalert to rejection. You learned to monitor people closely because your emotional safety once depended on it, and that survival pattern follows you into adulthood. You begin searching for reassurance everywhere. You become terrified of distance, silence, or emotional change because it awakens old wounds that never fully healed. The smallest shift in someone's behavior feels enormous because your nervous system is not reacting only to the present moment, it is reacting to years of stored fear. That realization changed my entire perspective. I stopped seeing myself as too emotional or too needy. Instead, I began understanding that a wounded part of me was still asking for safety, love, and consistency. The problem was that I kept expecting other people to heal wounds they did not create. I wanted relationships to rescue me from insecurities I had never truly faced within myself. Healing started when I finally stopped running from my pain and started listening to it. I had to sit alone with uncomfortable emotions instead of immediately seeking distraction or validation. I had to recognize the moments when my reactions were rooted more in old abandonment wounds than in present reason. That required honesty. It required self-awareness. It required compassion toward myself instead of shame. Because you cannot heal by attacking yourself for being wounded. You heal by understanding yourself. I started journaling my triggers. I began asking deeper questions whenever anxiety appeared. Why does this situation hurt so deeply? What fear is being activated right now? Most of the time, the answer had little to do with the current person and everything to do with the younger version of me who once felt emotionally unsafe. That inner child needed reassurance, but not from another relationship. It needed reassurance from me. Slowly, I learned how to comfort myself instead of depending entirely on others to calm my fears. I learned how to speak kindly to myself during moments of insecurity. I learned that abandonment wounds do not disappear overnight, but they lose power when you stop abandoning yourself emotionally. And the more I healed internally, the less fear had over my relationships. One of the hardest lessons I had to learn during my healing journey was that not everyone deserves unlimited access to your heart. For years, I believed that if I loved hard enough, stayed patient enough, and gave enough understanding, people would eventually treat me better. I kept making excuses for inconsistency. I kept tolerating emotional confusion because I was afraid that setting boundaries would push people away. But the truth is, constantly chasing people who trigger your insecurities will slowly destroy your peace. Anxious attachment often attracts unhealthy dynamics because fear makes you tolerate what emotionally healthy people would walk away from. When you are deeply afraid of abandonment, you start accepting breadcrumbs instead of real connection. You become attached to potential instead of reality. You hold on to the hope that someone will eventually become emotionally available while ignoring the damage their inconsistency is causing. Why? Or in the present, I had to admit something painful. Some people were not healing spaces for me. They were emotional triggers. Every conversation felt uncertain. Every interaction felt unstable. One day they were warm, the next day distant. One moment they wanted closeness, the next moment they disappeared emotionally. And because my nervous system was already wired for fear, those patterns kept intensifying my anxiety. Instead of feeling secure, I felt constantly alert, constantly overthinking, constantly trying to earn clarity from people who benefited from confusion. That is when I realized something powerful. Love should not require you to betray your own emotional well-being. Boundaries are not punishments. They are protection. Healing anxious attachment required me to stop chasing people who repeatedly activated my deepest insecurities. Not because I became cold or selfish, but because I finally understood that protecting my peace was necessary for growth. I had to stop fusing emotional chaos with chemistry. I had to stop interpreting inconsistency as passion. Just because someone can trigger strong emotions inside you does not mean they are meant for you. Emotionally unavailable people often keep anxious individuals trapped in cycles of hope and disappointment. You keep waiting for consistency while ignoring the reality standing in front of you. But healing begins when you stop listening only to words and start paying attention to patterns. Consistency matters. Effort matters. Emotional safety matters. I began choosing distance over dysfunction. That decision was difficult because anxious attachment fears separation more than suffering sometimes. But I eventually understood that staying connected to the wrong people was keeping me disconnected from myself. The moment I stopped chasing emotionally draining relationships, I finally had space to rebuild my confidence and inner stability. I no longer needed to beg for clarity, attention, or reassurance. See from people who could not provide healthy love consistently. And the more boundaries I created, the more peace entered my life. Because protecting your heart is not weakness. It is wisdom. One of the greatest turning points in my healing journey happened when I stopped trying to escape solitude and started learning from it. For years, being alone felt unbearable to me. Silence made me anxious because without constant communication, attention, or reassurance, I was forced to face my own thoughts. I depended heavily on other people to regulate my emotions. If someone comforted me, I felt okay. If they became distant, my mind immediately spiraled into fear. I did not realize how emotionally dependent I had become until life forced me to sit alone with myself. At first, solitude felt like punishment. I kept reaching for distractions. I wanted noise, validation, messages, anything that could temporarily calm the anxiety inside me. But eventually, I understood that constantly avoiding yourself was part of the problem. Healing anxious attachment required me to develop emotional stability from within instead of expecting other people to constantly provide it for me. That process was not easy. There were nights when my thoughts felt overwhelming. Nights when I wanted to seek reassurance from people who were never truly capable of giving me peace. But instead of reacting impulsively, I started practicing discipline. I learned how to pause before sending emotional messages. I learned how to sit with uncomfortable feelings without immediately trying to escape them. That changed me more than anything else. Because emotional security is built through self-regulation, I started journaling every day. Writing down my fears helped me understand them instead of becoming controlled by them. I started spending quiet time reflecting on my patterns, my triggers, and the beliefs I carried about myself. I also began praying more deeply, asking for wisdom, peace, and emotional strength. Instead of constantly asking for people to stay in my life. And slowly, something powerful began happening. The silence that once terrified me started healing me. Solitude became a place where I rebuilt my identity. Without constant outside validation, I began discovering who I truly was beneath the anxiety. I learned that I could comfort myself during difficult moments. I learned that emotions are temporary and do not always require immediate reaction. Most importantly, I learned that peace is not found in controlling people, it is found in controlling yourself. Discipline became a form of self-respect. Every time I chose patience over panic, I grew stronger. Every time I stopped myself from chasing reassurance, I gained confidence. Every time I faced loneliness without abandoning myself emotionally, I healed a little more. Anxious attachment weakens when you stop depending entirely on others to calm your inner chaos. The more emotionally grounded I became within myself, less power fear had over my relationships. I no longer felt desperate for constant attention because I had finally learned how to create stability within my own mind, heart, and spirit. One of the deepest reasons anxious attachment creates so much suffering is because it constantly tries to control outcomes. When you are afraid of being abandoned, your mind starts believing that if you say the right thing, act the right way, or stay emotionally available enough, you can prevent people from leaving. You begin trying to manage every conversation, every interaction, and every emotional shift because uncertainty feels terrifying. I lived that way for a long time without realizing how exhausted it was making me. I was always overthinking. If someone became quiet, I immediately searched for reasons. If their energy changed, I panicked internally. If I sensed distance, I tried harder to fix everything before it fell apart. What I called love was often fear trying to maintain control. The problem is that control can never create true peace. It only creates temporary relief. Even if someone reassures you for a moment, the fear eventually returns because the real issue is not external uncertainty, it is the internal belief that you are unsafe unless everything goes exactly the way you want. Healing began when I finally accepted something difficult. Not everything is meant to stay, and forcing people to remain in your life will never create healthy love. That truth hurt at first because anxious attachment wants guarantees. It wants certainty. It wants promises that nobody will ever leave or change. But life does not work that way. People change. Relationships evolve. Some connections are temporary. And trying to control every outcome only creates more anxiety, not less. I had to learn how to surrender. Not surrender from weakness, but surrender from trust. Trusting that what is genuinely meant for me will not require me to betray myself to keep it. Trusting that reason. Love does not disappear because I stopped overperforming emotionally. Trusting that I do not need to constantly chase, prove, or panic in order to deserve connection. That shift changed my entire mindset. Instead of obsessing over whether people would stay, I started focusing on whether relationships were healthy for me in the first place. Instead of forcing closeness, I began allowing things to unfold naturally. I stopped trying to manipulate outcomes through fear-driven behavior. And slowly, peace entered my life. Because faith brings a kind of emotional freedom that control never can. Faith reminds you that your life is bigger than one relationship. It reminds you that rejection is not the end of your story. It reminds you that delays, endings, and disappointments can sometimes redirect you towards something healthier and more aligned with your growth. The more I trusted divine timing, the less desperate I became. I no longer felt the need to force every connection to work. Understood that some people are lessons, some are blessings, and some are simply temporary chapters meant to prepare you for deeper healing. And when you finally stop gripping everything so tightly, your heart begins to rest. Healing anxious attachment was not about becoming emotionless, distant, or cold. It was about finally learning how to love myself enough to stop living in fear every single day. I discovered that peace begins when you stop begging for reassurance and start building security within your own soul. The moment you stop chasing people who drain you, stop abandoning yourself to keep others comfortable, and stop trying to control every outcome, your life begins to change. Real healing happens when you understand that your worth was never dependent on who stayed, who left, or who failed to see your value. You are already enough, and when you truly believe that, love no longer becomes a battlefield inside your mind, it becomes something peaceful, honest, and safe. Thank you all for listening. If this message spoke to your heart, never forget this. Your healing matters, your peace matters, and your future relationships will reflect the love and respect you learned to give yourself today. Keep growing, keep healing, and keep choosing yourself without guilt. Your best chapter is still ahead of you.